The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
My father was a homesteader, and he took his homestead out in 1905, which is the same year that the province was formed out of the Northwest Territories. So he's an old-timer, and he was one of the builders. And we grew up on my dad's homestead. It was a very, very rural community, but there were a lot of people in it because it very quickly filled in. He was one of the originals, but it very quickly filled in. And on nearly every half section, there was a family. So there were a lot of people. The school was full of local kids, some of which virtually didn't speak any English. They came from Ukrainian families and Swedish families that had settled in the area. We had no high school. I took my high school by correspondence courses, and we didn't. That doesn't. You know, you might visualize that sitting at home with a coal oil lamp. Well, there was some of that, but we took those courses in our one-room schoolroom, where the teacher was generally were fairly young ladies because the war came on in '39. And all the men went into the forces, so our teachers were basically young ladies. And we would write our exams, but they all had to go into Regina for correction. And you'd write your exams in June, and sometime in August you'd get a letter saying you had passed or hadn't passed, and so on. But it was a very active community. We had a very good hockey team, all local farm kids. At the tournaments up in North Battleford, they always wanted our team there, and we often came away with the trophy. And we had some very good baseball players. The farm right next to ours, that adjoined ours, one of the boys from there and my older brother were both invited to the Detroit Red Wings camp in Saskatoon in the early 1940s. They were good hockey players, but the war was on. So instead of going through the steps that would take you to the professional leagues, they went off into the military. My older brother was a pilot in the Air Force and flew in 437 Squadron out of Britain. And when I was growing up, aviation was basically my sole interest, apart from agriculture. We had a very good, what used to be called junior achievement clubs, which were the forerunners of 4-H. And in 1942, at 16 years of age, I had the good luck to win the provincial competitions and represent our province in the national competitions down in Toronto. And I must say, from a kid from the homestead, the train trip to Toronto and seeing the skyline at that time was the Royal York Hotel, you know, and it was basically a good life. When I was about 5 or 6 years of age, it was on a dark, stormy evening. A little airplane flew over, and it obviously went down somewhere. So we went looking for it, and we found it about half a mile from our farm buildings, and it was parked up against a bluff of trees out of the wind, and the two men were putting canvas sheets over the wing, and they were going to sleep on the ground, and these sheets over the wing would be their walls that would be open at each end, of course. Well, when we found them, my father quickly convinced them they would be far better off to come back to our farm and sleep in our hayloft, where at least they'd be dry and my mother could make them something warm to eat. And I'll never forget the next morning, dawn bright and clear, and we all traipsed out to this airplane. And it was the noisiest darn thing you ever heard, you know. We were farming with horses, and we get this thing roaring away. And one of the pilots, or one of the two men, was busy fixing up the aircraft, getting ready to fly, and the other wanted to walk along this pasture between the bluffs of trees to make sure there were no big rocks or holes in the ground from badgers and so on, so that they could take off. And I remember running alongside this guy, and he looked like a giant to me. He was wearing breeches and boots, and he had leggings and so on. And when they took off, it didn't take them very long. They flew around just over the tops of the poplar trees and waved, and we waved. And I'm not sure if that was the beginning of my interest in aviation or not. But where we grew up in what was then called northern Saskatchewan, it's actually not more than halfway up the province, but it was the northern edge of the agricultural area. If you went north from there, there were basically no roads. So anything that went in there either went in the winter with tractor trains when the ground was frozen, or it was flown in. Most of the traffic to the north by air was out of Edmonton and some out of Prince Albert. There was a little airfield at North Battleford that occasionally we'd see an airplane flying around and so on. And when you saw one of those, you stopped whatever you were doing and gazed at it till it disappeared. And it looked pretty darn attractive compared to sitting behind 6 or 8 horses in the field with a plow underneath you and so on. So aviation was my interest, and my brother, older brother, as I said, got into the Air Force and was a pilot. When I turned 18 years of age, he wrote to me, he was then in England, and said, "There's no point in joining the Air Force. You'll never get near an airplane." His expression was, "All you'll do is clean latrines," because the Commonwealth Air Training Plan had been so successful and trained so many airmen from all over the Allied world, really, that there were more pilots than there were airplanes to fly. So about then, I somehow, I can't remember exactly how, I heard of the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm. There was no Fleet Air Arm in Canada, in our Navy at that time. And so I rode off from the old farmstead to the Admiralty in London and said, "Is there any chance of getting into the Fleet Air Arm?" And I got a letter back telling me what I had to do. And there were 3 requirements. One was you had to have completed your high school to university entrance level. Secondly, you had to provide 2 letters of reference to show you were a reasonably decent person. And you had to pass the medical and so on. And all this took time because it was done by mail. And mail in those days traveled by train in Canada and steamship if it was going overseas. So there was quite long pauses between some of these steps. So I was able to send off references right away because, as I said earlier, I had represented our province in the national competition. So the local reeve and the local parson gave me very flowery letters about what a good fellow I was. But because of our exams having been written and having to go to Regina for correction, it was not till late in August that I learned that I had achieved my high school to entry level, to what we used to call senior matric in those days, to the university. So I sent that off. And a while later, I got a letter back saying, "Now you have to have a medical and go to the airport, the RCAF station in Saskatoon, and have your medical." Well, Saskatoon was 95 miles away, and nobody had money, you know. And I'll never forget, because by then it was fall and we were starting the harvest, and my father, who was a First World War veteran and fairly badly shot up during that war, always had some difficulty, so he depended very much on his sons to carry the work. But it rained, and you're from, you know Saskatchewan mud. When it rains, you don't go anywhere. So I asked my dad, I said, "Give me a few dollars. I want to get a bus from the nearest town and go to Saskatoon. And he just told me, don't be ridiculous. You're not going to the Royal Navy. D-Day had happened in June, and this was now in the fall. The Canadian government was only interested in recruiting people for the army, and the whole question of conscription was a big political issue across the country. So I listened to my father tell me that I wasn't going to fly airplanes. I went outside and I got my brother's old bike and headed for Saskatoon. and you know what the mud was like. You couldn't ride on the road most of the way, so you would be down in the ditch where the grass was long and wet, and it would keep the mud from plugging up your bike. And the number 16 highway was 20 miles south of us. Number 16 is now called the Yellowhead. We just use it as number 16. So between walking and pushing and riding my bike on little patches, I got down to the Yellowhead. And it was then a gravel highway, and gravel highways just had ruts in them where the cars used to go, and you'd hear some vehicle coming behind you. You had to get off your bike because you couldn't get it out of the track, you know. It would be a pile of sand it could throw you, and they'd go by and be rocks flying everywhere. And eventually I got into Saskatoon quite late in the day, and I knew where the Y was. And the reason I knew that was because in 1939, we'd gone down there to see the King and Queen and two princesses during their royal visit. And I saw a whole bunch of men in fancy red uniforms coming out of that building. So I had seen the RCMP, but never in red uniforms. So I inquired, and they said, oh, that's the YMCA, and they've brought people in from all over the province for security, and that's where they're billeted, you know. So I knew where it was. And I went around there and I explained my dilemma. So they gave me a meal, they gave me a bed. I wanted to take the bike up to my room, and they said, no, you can't take that dirty thing, but it was my brother's bike. So, but they said you can store it by the furnace downstairs. So I did that. Next morning I got up, I could hardly walk. I was so stiff and sore, I could hardly walk. But again, the Y gave me a good breakfast, and I went down, and I never did see the janitor or the fireman or whatever he was, but somebody had cleaned my bike up. It looked better than I did in my sodden clothes from the exercise the day before. So I rode out to the airport, and it was then, it's now called the Diefenbaker Airport, but at that time it was a RCAF training station and a service flying training school flying Harvards. And I got to the gate, and the bar was down, and these people said, you can't come in here. And I said, I have to come in, I have to go for a medical. And they kind of laughed at me. And I put my letter out from the Admiralty telling me to go to Saskatoon for a medical. They looked at that in somewhat disbelief, but they allowed me through. And I went down to the medical building, which was about 3 buildings down from the gate. And they said, we'll have your eye on you, and don't you go off anywhere but to that building. So I went there, and there was a young Air Force lady, that asked me what I wanted, and I told her. And I think she was somewhat surprised too. Anyway, she disappeared and spoke to a doctor, and she came back and said, the doctor will see you in a few moments. And I was escorted into his room. But again, I had trouble walking. I was so sore and so stiff. And he said to me, what's the matter with you? You got rheumatism or something? And I said, no, I'm very healthy. I just had a difficult day yesterday. Well, what did you do yesterday? So I told him about my bike ride, and he looked at me and he said, you did that yesterday in the showers and the rain, and you came 95 miles on an old bicycle? I said, yes, sir, I had to get here. He said, well, you're obviously fit enough to fly any airplanes we've got, but I've got to check your eyes and make sure that you're not colorblind and you can see. So that was my medical. It took me all that effort for about 20-minute medical, and off he sent it. And in due course, I got a letter back from the Fleet Air Arm saying you have to go to Halifax and out to Eastern Passage, which is where the Fleet Air Arm, the British Navy Fleet Air Arm, had a hangar and a runway where ships that came in that had aircraft would land and so on. And they said, and they gave me a travel warrant for a train trip down there. So off I went. And by this time it was, quite late in November by the time all this was done. And I got there, got sworn in, and mid-December was put on a troop ship, and away we went to England. And we landed in Liverpool on Christmas Eve, 1944. Yeah, 1944. And off we went to a Fleet Air Arm base, which was an active military base at Lyon-Solent on the Channel. And they immediately put us on a few days' leave. Well, I just got off the farm. I had no money really, excepting a few pounds that they gave us. So I decided that the right thing to do was go and see my brother, and I knew where his station was from my correspondence with him. So I went there, and on the 2nd of January, 1945, flew with him into Eindhoven in Holland, and the Battle of the Bulge was going on just a few miles away, and they were flying supplies in and so on. And so I went from milking cows to being close to the battlefield, not doing anything worthwhile, of course, other than be there, all in a matter of a few weeks, really. And that's how I got started. We then went through quite a period of initiation, a lot of foot drill, a lot of aircraft recognition, hours and hours doing navigation exercises on paper and one thing and another. We had to learn to swim. We had to learn to what they call boat pulling, what you and I would call rowing, in cutters and whalers. So I'm not quite sure what that had to do with airplanes, but anyway, we did all that. And late in April, finally, we went off to a flying school, and it was where they were flying Tiger Moths, and it was run by the RAF, not by the Navy, although we were all Navy boys. And within 10 days of arriving, VE Day happened. Right after VE Day, they said flying training's over. So we just had a handful of hours after all this effort, never did anything worthwhile, and we didn't know what was going to happen to us. There was some suggestion we were going to go to the lower deck as seamen in the Royal Navy. Well, if we'd wanted that, we would have joined the Royal Canadian Navy, which was better pay and better food, I might say. But in any case, they sent us back home, and by the fall, just after VJ Day, when the atomic bombs were dropped in Japan, I was discharged. So I was less than a year. I did not accomplish any of my hopes and dreams to fly Spitfires and so on. And I had to look around for something to do. And I got a job driving a Caterpillar tractor for a big farm, what was at that time called a big farmer. He farmed about 5 sections of land in the Kindersley area. It would be a small farm today in that province, but at the time it was big. And at the end of the harvest season, there was, he had a lot of irons in the fire, and one of them was to round up wild horses. There were lots of them on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border in the sandhills there. And there's still a wild herd up in the British bloc near Sutherland. And anyway, we would round up these horses and break them. And then they would be shipped down to Montreal, where they were sold on the market and one thing or another. And so he said, would you stay on and help break horses? Well, it was an option with a few dollars, and they were few. But about that time, I saw an ad in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix saying that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was starting up its air division again. There had been aircraft in the force prior to the war, but in 1939, all the planes and the pilots were turned over to the Air Force. So they said they were starting up again, and anybody interested should report to the local detachment and so on. So I hustled down to the detachment, and the old corporal there, I'll never forget him sitting behind his desk with his pipe, looking at me and listening to me, why I wanted to fly for the RCMP. And finally he said, since that ad was in the paper, you're the third young man that's come in here expressing an interest. And I'm sure it's like that in every detachment all across Canada. But he said, the difference is the first 2 that came in, they brought a logbook showing completed tours of ops. You have a few hours in a Tiger Moth. And he said, we're not hiring people to teach them to fly. We're hiring a good, experienced pilots to fly a few planes that we're getting, and we're going to teach them to be policemen. So that ended that. And you'll last your 5 years. And by then, aviation may have opened up in Canada again, and you can follow your dream. Well, I jumped at the opportunity and wrote the exam right that same day, and quickly got a reply back from the force saying, yes, we'll accept you, but you don't report to Regina till your 21st birthday, which was in April of 1947, and we'll sign you up then. So that's exactly what I did. But by 5 years, my intention was never to make a career out of police work at that time. I had a lot of respect for the force. My father, along with being a homesteader, was also the local justice of the peace. So occasionally we would see members of the force, never in fancy uniforms, coming up either in old cars or snowmobiles with big propellers at the back of them, to speak to my dad about issues and so on. So I had a lot of respect for them, and I was really quite surprised how easily it was to get in. I thought they were kind of Superman, you know. And anyway, I got into the force, and before I had 5 years, I was stationed alone with my own detachment, and that was a wonderful life. You know, it really was. You were integrated totally in the community. You were an important cog in the community. Your social life, which there wasn't a lot of time for, because you were a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week policeman back in those days. There was no such thing as overtime and shifts if you were out on detachment. So, but it was a good life, and I was fairly athletic, so I always played on the local hockey team and one thing or another, which helped cement you with the community. And at times when you needed help and backup, people were always ready to help you. It was a great life. That detachment life, and especially when you were stationed alone, and I was twice in that situation in my early years, it was just a great life. You saw very few members of the force. You had no radios back in those days. About every 6 weeks, what was called the patrol sergeant was supposed to drop in and making sure you were still keeping the work up and taking care of the complaints. And they'd come and they would destroy the liquor exhibits that you'd seized, and they'd go around town asking, how's the constable doing, you know? If they got a good report, they'd go back and say, yeah, he's doing okay, keep going. And it was a good life. From there, after a few years of that, I was just a good enough hockey player that I played for a team that had made the provincial finals in the Intermediate Hockey League. And I used to have to get permission to leave my area to go and play playoff games and one thing or another. But the RCMP had a good hockey team in Calgary, and they played in what was known as the Service League. Well, when I got stationed in Hanna, Alberta, they knew I was a hockey player, so I would get a phone call. Back in those days, nobody owned their own cars. The only transport you had was your police car, and you weren't supposed to use that for private purposes. As long as you were staying within your area, that nobody complained if you used it to go shopping and one thing or another in town, as long as you stayed within your area. If you want to leave your detachment area, though, you had to get the authority from subdivision. So in the winter, I'd get a phone call from the manager of the hockey team, who was the subdivision NCO, old Staff Sergeant Bob Gray. And he'd say, how's it going out there, Simmonds? And I didn't know if to say I'm rushed off my feet, which I generally was, because he might say, well, you better not come into town then. I'd say, oh, it's okay, staff, everything's fine. Well, he said, we're getting complaints about traffic along number 9 highway, which was the number 7 highway, came out of Saskatoon, when it got to the Alberta border, became number 9 highway and went on into Calgary. And he says, we're getting complaints about traffic on that highway, and we would like to do a little extra patrolling. Would you have time to do that? Yes, sir, I can work that out. Or, yes, staff, I can work that out. And he says, be at the Stampede Corral for 8 o'clock face-off. So I had my permission to use the police car for sporting purposes outside my own area. And after a couple of winters like that, I got transferred into Calgary, into plain clothes. And that was also a wonderful experience. We had a lot of very capable investigators there. And before long, I was by then a corporal. And before long, you were investigating homicides. You investigated everything. This force was not specialized to the extent that it is a few years later. You were in what was called CIB, and you did everything. You might have a drug case, you might have a murder case, you might have a fraud case. You had a whole range of work, and you were very, very busy. And it was a great experience. And I did well there. I was fortunate with the promotions, and I ended up as the staff sergeant in charge of the plainclothes in Calgary. And then in 1966, early on, the OC of the subdivision said, well, we're going to bring you in as the subdivision NCO. I was the junior staff sergeant, but I had the senior position. And so I went back into uniform as the subdivision NCO, which was a good experience too, because you dealt with the media, you dealt with outside the force, as well as keeping the OC fully briefed on what was going on around the subdivision and so on. And in 1966, I was promoted to the great rank of sub-inspector and moved out to British Columbia as the second in charge of Burnaby Detachment, which at that time was the largest detachment in the force. It's not anymore. And that's where I first met Al Nicholson and a number of other very, very fine people. And I spent 5 years in that detachment. And it was upgraded to the rank of superintendent, and I was too junior an inspector to fill that rank. So I was moved over to division headquarters in Victoria. And that was a good experience too. My position was shown as staffing, and I did some staffing, but the CO, who didn't have a labeled position, made me what was called the planning officer for a division. And that took me all over the province, deciding what air services we needed, what marine services we needed, where adjustments should be made in detachments and so on. And it was a tremendously good experience. And after a year there, I was moved back to Vancouver as the second in charge of the subdivision.